Hey, my friendly hello! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined in a few minutes by one of our good friends, Ryan McIntyre, who does such great work over at the Sports Gambling Podcast Network. Take a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball, and we're going to talk about one of the conferences that is very near and dear to him, the Big 12, as he also does the Ryan and Rush show along with his duties over at the Sports Gambling Podcast Network that is all dedicated to West Virginia athletics. We have to take a look at some of these mid-tier teams out there in the Big 12. There's a lot of pressure on Cincinnati, in my opinion, this year. We're going to talk a little bit about them. I do think that Houston is the creme de la creme team out there. We're certainly going to be hitting upon that. We're also going to be looking at some of the recent coaching, shall we say, movements and some of the recent coaching trends that we've seen over the last few off seasons, with there being quite a few NBA guys that were like game managers, what have you, at the NBA level, getting college basketball coaching jobs. We've seen a few of those guys in the Big 12. We've got Utah undergoing that change here in this offseason, and I've also noticed that a lot of the guys that have been hired on from the D2 ranks going to the Division I level, they have paid dividends as well, so we're going to be talking about that and so much more with Ryan. He's such a wealth of knowledge, so always great to get him aboard, and if you ever do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you, for this podcast, you have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And while I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. EdgeBoost is making sure that bettors are able to have access to their funds whenever and wherever. EdgeBoost makes sure that 100% of gambling transactions do get approved. And when you go to edgeboost.bet, put in that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That'll get you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. And now how about if we do chat with our good friend Ryan McIntyre? Again, he and Kobe Dant over there at the Sports Gambling Podcast Network just doing absolutely supremely great work. And then you got the Ryan Rush show that is all dedicated to West Virginia athletics. To be able to follow Ryan on the old Twitter/X, that is at Moneyline_Mac, Mac spelled M-A-C. And Ryan, it is always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it, Greg. Always good to talk college hoops.
It is always great to have you aboard. And Ryan, how about if we do talk a little bit about the Big 12? It's a conference that you're very near and dear with because of all of your time over there at West Virginia. Just how has the landscape changed over the last few years? Because obviously with realignment, there's a bunch of new teams in there, and it feels like Houston has been able to do a great job of forming themselves in this conference. Obviously Arizona last year, they had themselves a great time as well, but it feels like teams outside of Houston and Arizona have had a little bit of a rough time, and the travel for teams like Central Florida and company, it feels like it's really gotten to them, and they've just been swallowed whole by this conference.
I would agree with that. I think BYU has also adapted really well. And I just think that Houston, BYU, Arizona, they've really got their NIL in order as they entered the Big 12. And I think they've used the Big 12 to elevate their program even more. Houston, just with their culture and brand under Kelvin Sampson, and they just have been unbelievable over the last couple of years, getting to a national championship, and very well could have got to another one if Jamal Shedd hadn't gone down. But Arizona transitioned nicely, I thought, last year. It took them a minute to find their identity, and then BYU as well. But you kind of look at the other teams, Cincinnati, UCF, Arizona State, Colorado. I think that they're all just still searching for their identity. Cincinnati's been the puzzling one just because they've had a track record in the past of being a basketball school, whether it was the Huggs era or the Cronin era. A big year for Wes Miller for sure here.
Yep, and I think that they are one of the most interesting teams out there in the Big 12 because I thought that Wes Miller was honestly on the hot seat a little bit last year, and I do think that Wes Miller is an amazing coach. I think that he is going to be able to get this team back to the NCAA tournament, but it's sort of like one of those situations where you're thinking, when is that going to be able to happen? And I just take a look at this roster with bringing back Day Thomas, bringing back Jizzle James, guys that have been in the backcourt for a few seasons, and it just makes me think in the back of my mind, if it doesn't happen this year, when is it going to happen for them, especially with a guy in Kirk Reese who's got a lot of experience coming in there.
This is, year number 5 now for Wes Miller, so they've given him every opportunity, still not able to get to the dance. Year 3 in the Big 12. We need to see that leap. Last year, I thought that it was really disappointing that they weren't able to get to the dance because they had all that experience coming back from the team that I thought finished pretty strong in 2024, but they just weren't able to put it together. Offensively, they were challenged, it felt like, finishing outside the top 100.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that they're going to be one of the more interesting teams in this conference. As joining me on the show, we do have Ryan McIntyre, who does such great work over at the Sports Gambling Podcast Network, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And I feel like this man should have been on the hot seat for the last few years, but I look at Central Florida as another one of those interesting teams as well. And for Central Florida, they do, ironically enough, lose Mustafa Thiem to Cincinnati, so had a few inter-conference transfers. But that said, I feel like they brought in a few rock-solid pieces like JaMychal Stillwell and Themis Folks. Both of those guys played together when they were at UW-Milwaukee last year, and UW-Milwaukee was a rock-solid mid-major. They bring in a guy in Riley Kugel who really showed some flashes of greatness when he was over at Florida. And then Devin Cambridge, it feels like, has been in college basketball for about 500 billion years. He comes in as well, and I look at Central Florida. If the pieces can fit together, I honestly see some upside here, but it feels like Johnny Dawkins just hasn't been able to do just that. He hasn't been able to get these pieces to fit together, and as a result, we've seen some underachievement from this team over the last few years.
I would agree with you, and I think that their identity is they've been trying to load up on those 6'4" to 6'8" athletes, and they've also kind of felt like struggled to score at times. 2 years ago, they really struggled to score, finishing around 150 offensively. Last year, it was a little bit of both, just inconsistency play. They went through that 7-game losing streak in the middle of gauntlet of the Big 12. So here they go. They load up more on the portal once again, coming in. And sometimes you hit on the portal, sometimes you don't. But they are going to have experience with guys that have played at the high major level, whether it's Cambridge, Parker, and Freeman, and different guys. So I think it's all about how their locker room is for these UCF Knights next year.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that they're one of the more interesting teams in the conference because when I take a look at the Big 12, it almost feels a little bit like the Big 10, where you do have those top end teams. Like Houston, I don't think that there's much debate that they should be the number one team in the conference. So I know there might be a person or two that might make the case for BYU with bringing in AJ DeBansa, bringing in Robert Wright. They're a team that's rock solid. And then you've got that obvious tier number two with the likes of Iowa State, Kansas, Arizona, and I don't think that anyone should be sleeping on Texas Tech. But then it just feels like a logjam with a team that we talked about before in Cincinnati. Where does Baylor fit into things? TCU is always a little bit of a plucky team. And then a team that you know very, very well out there in your home state of West Virginia.
I think the tier definitely is separated a little bit. I would say Houston is the top team headed into next year just with all the returning production. I value returning production a lot more than a lot of different portal pieces. But love what Texas Tech has been able to do in the portal. They retained a bunch of guys as well, BYU and Arizona. And Iowa State has been a really consistent program under TJ Otzelberger, being a top 3 seed back-to-back years. And I do think Kansas, although they have struggled a little bit just with their inconsistencies on the offensive defensive end this last couple of years, but I just thought that the roster structure the last couple of years wasn't very good. I like the way that they put together this roster, so I would throw them almost in that top tier. And then you mentioned it, you kind of get into the next tier with Baylor, trying to get back to more of a defensive program by Mountaineers, and then Kansas State and TCU that have been NCAA tournament teams on and off.
Yep, and I do think that we've got ourselves a lot of fun to be taking a look at with this conference because I look at a team in Utah who obviously had a lot of turnover in the offseason. I think that they could be one of the more, shall we say, interesting teams in the conference. Not that I think that they're going to be like a top 5 team in the conference or anything like that, but they've got a lot of experience and they don't necessarily have that top guy, but it feels like they just have a lot of depth with someone like a James Okonkwo down low. Who, you know him very well. He began his career over at West Virginia. Sadu Traore is someone who's 6'7", has some size. Babacar Faye is a relatively solid big man. I think that they really lack something with regards to the backcourt. I would have liked to see them address that guard situation a little bit more because it feels like Don McHenry and not much else, but this team has a lot of, shall we say, positionless basketball, a lot of 6'6", 6'7" guys, and a lot of guys I think are going to go down and do a nice job of grabbing some boards.
I agree with you on how this roster is constructed, and I think it speaks to the new coaching regime. Alex Jensen's an NBA guy. The NBA has really become positionless basketball. So he's coming over from the Dallas Mavericks, and we've seen how they've kind of loaded up and that organization on size at the different positions. So I think they're trying to duplicate that as well. BYU also tried to do that the last couple of years and has had success. So the two schools out in Utah going the NBA route.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that that's become a little bit more of a trend here in college basketball. And I want to hear your thoughts on that because obviously for BYU, it worked out really well for them last year. We saw them take off, have a nice run in the NCAA tournament, obviously stopped short in the Sweet 16 by Alabama, but we've noticed a few mid-major teams going that route as Radford. I know they hired on a guy from the NBA ranks. I know that Iona has done so as well. We're talking about it with Utah doing it as well. And do you think that this might be a little bit more of a, shall we say, wave of the future with some of these like NBA assistants, some of these, they always like to call them like game managers and everything like that. Do you think that we might see more of these guys in college basketball moving forward?
Maybe. I'm still a little bit hesitant on it just because BYU's NIL and resources are at a completely different level than a lot of these teams. So Utah, Florida State, they're trying to go that route, but I don't think they have the resources that BYU had. So I want to see another year of sample size or another 2 years before I jump to a conclusion here. Because one thing with this portal and NIL era since about 2022, I feel like I've changed my opinion or as we keep going on with more data points as we go along.
And I think that this is a great stopping point for part one to go into part two. I want to address the fact that we've seen a lot of Division II coaches go up to the D1 ranks, have a lot of success, and then with our good friend Ryan, he does such a great job of taking a look at this game of college basketball. Have to ask him if he's had a little bit of a change of heart, if there's a team or two out there that he's feeling a little bit more bullish/bearish on than he did a few months ago. That's coming up on the flip side right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Big XII Family Podcast. We're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Big XII Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Ryan McIntyre. He does excellent work over at the Sports Gambling Podcast Network with our good friend Kobe Dant with the show The College Experience. He also does the Ryan and Rush show that is dedicated all to West Virginia athletics. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter /X at Moneyline_Mac, spelled MAC. And Ryan, we were talking in the previous segment about these guys that went from the NBA down to college and their success. How about if we talk about another brand of coach that has had success? These guys going from the Division II level to the Division I level, a lot of these guys, I feel like, for the schools that have taken a gamble on them, they've really been able to pay off in droves. I mean, look no further than Ben McCollum, what he was able to do over at Drake last year. Now he's over at Iowa this season. And how do you take a look at these guys going from the D2 ranks to the D1 level? Because I think that winning is contagious. And I think that in this day and age, in this landscape, these guys that coach at a little bit of a lower level, especially the guys that have some junior college experience, because there's so much turnover there in this NIL era, these are the guys that are really excelling. And these are the guys that are really providing a lot of bang for your buck from a betting perspective, and obviously these schools that hire them on.
I agree, and I think a lot of it has to do with they just have familiarity with the coaching staff, with the culture, with the terminology. We kind of saw it on the football side with Cignetti going from James Madison over to Indiana last year. So I think a lot of teams, it's amazing. I know football and basketball are different sports, but I feel like both are always trying to copy one another in terms of just how they're approaching the NIL, the portal, the resources, and how to just deal with this new age of college sports. So I agree. If you can bring over guys from your previous stop, and McCollum's trying to double down again and do it from Drake over to Iowa after coming up from the D2 ranks 2 years ago. So I always think that that's beneficial. And I think that's why a guy like DeVries at West Virginia last year was able to hit the ground running as well, or Dusty May bringing over Big Vlad over from FAU and those kind of guys.
And I do think that it's just so interesting in this landscape and this day and age as well. As joining me on the show, we do have Ryan McIntyre, who does such great work over at the Sports Gambling Podcast Network, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And because we take a look at Houston, who we both feel like is going to be the top team in the Big 12 entering into the season. And for Kelvin Sampson, I feel like he actually very much benefited from a few years in the NBA. He benefited from just the fact that he's got a wide array of different experiences being at Indiana and having the penalties that he experienced there, which in this day and age, he would have never, ever experienced any of those whatsoever. But I mean, that's where college basketball was at back in the day. But I feel like he's benefited from that. And I know that you were just talking about DeVries, what he's been able to do going to Indiana, the fact that he went through, for lack of a better term, the school of hard knocks. And how much do you take a look at these guys that they've had to have a lot of different jobs over the last few years, and that being beneficial for them? Because I feel like like in this day and age where you're probably not going to have the same roster in back-to-back years, these guys have had experience at the junior college level. These guys that perhaps have been at a professional level, they're more of an advantage than, say, maybe some of these guys have been at the same spot for 20, 25 years and maybe are just used to the same old, same old.
I've always been a big proponent of the junior college guys because at the JUCO level, you're replacing your roster every single year. And I think that's why a guy like Chris Beard down at Ole Miss has had so much success year after year in this portal era, getting used to a new team, grinding them, and forming them into a really tough team come March. And I think you also look out in Lubbock, and I think what Grant McCaslin's been able to do, adapting, playing two different styles. At North Texas, he was more of a slowed-down defensive team. In Lubbock last year, he sped it up a little bit, got to the Elite Eight, almost got to the Final Four. So I definitely think the JUCO guys have had a little bit of a leg up here.
Yep, and I'm so glad that you mentioned Grant McCaslin as well, because I take a look at these like way too early top 25s and everything like that, and I do feel like Texas Tech is one of the most undervalued team in all of college basketball. I recognize that you lose Darian Williams, but Christian Anderson I feel like is being slept upon a little bit too much in that backcourt. I love the fact that they brought in Lawan Watts in the transfer portal. Donovan Atwell, he comes on over from UNC Greensboro. I think that he's going to be able to be a nice contributor right away. And for Texas Tech, I feel like this is a team that's almost, for lack of a better term, hiding in plain sight. And I think we'd be looking at them completely differently had they made the Final Four instead of Florida.
I agree. And Florida won it all. Their toughest game, I guess was Houston, because Houston led that game for 39 and a half minutes. But heck, Texas Tech led them for about 38 and a half minutes. So, and they bring back Toppin. I know he got a nice payday, but bringing in guys that have really produced, and they seem to really identify what they want in the portal. You spoke earlier about that positionless basketball, and I think they have that as well in Lubbock with guys like Lawan Watts, Josiah Mosley, Atwell, Bryan, Bamboy, guys that are between that 6'5" and 6'9" size. So I think Texas Tech, once again, is going to be a Final Four contender as long as Grant McCaslin's there.
Yep, and I think that they're one of those teams out there in the Big 12 because we talk about Texas Tech so much, and rightfully so. Kansas is always going to be talked about for better or for worse. Heck, we talk about Kansas State a lot because they spend a lot of money and have not necessarily gotten the results quite as much. Arizona, they always get the attention, but I do think that for Texas Tech, it's going to be a rock-solid season for them. And I always love to ask you this, Ryan, because you do such a great job all throughout the offseason of taking a look at this great sport. Has there been a team or two that you've done a little bit more of a deep dive on, and maybe you're changing your opinion on them a little bit, whether that be to the positive or the negative? It could be any team out there, high major, low major, mid major, does not matter, but just a team over the last few weeks that you've been taking a look at, and maybe you're starting to have a little bit of a change, whether that be for better or for worse.
I'll keep it in the Big 12, and I kind of have liked what Baylor has done. I think it's been a little bit more under the radar. They were so guard-oriented the last couple of years that I felt like they sacrificed a lot of the guys on the interior. I think they have a lot more size, and I think they're going to be a lot tougher than they were. And those two national championship, or the national championship team, and then the team that didn't get a chance to compete when that was in the top five in the COVID year that got canceled, they really got it done on the defensive end. So bringing over Bodo from High Point as a nice rim protector. Also, a guy like Skillings from Cincinnati that's already produced in this league, or Rochuk over from Oregon State. I like kind of the pieces that have been productive players, more positionless basketball at the mid-major level. So I think Baylor could be a little bit underrated with less bigger names this year.
Yep, and with Baylor, we saw things just really toilet bowl on them last year. I know that VJ Edgecombe came out and said that he really didn't love the style in college basketball. He was obviously one of their top players last year. It felt like Baylor was a little bit of a do-or-die team from three-point range as well. I think that balance is going to be able to help them out. And Scott Drew, he's a guy that has won a national title in the last few years. This guy clearly knows how to coach, and a man that clearly knows his college basketball, that'd be Ryan. You do such a great job over at the Sports Gambling Podcast Network, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love. So I'll love to get people at home know it's all on tap for you, and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Always appreciate it, Greg. Yeah, go check us over at the College Experience. We're wrapping up football, and then we're going to move over to our coaches tour for college basketball. 2 months till opening night there on November the 3rd.
Absolutely, and I know that Ryan, he's doing such a great job of getting set for what is going to be an amazing college basketball season, and every single time he joins me, he lends such great insight. So, big thanks to Ryan for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters EM. The naming does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is via an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I am with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season, rain or shine. Going to be getting some more conference previews here in the coming days and coming weeks as well. So be on the lookout for that, and be on the lookout for a fresh podcast tomorrow. Thank you so much.